Hi everybody, welcome back, glad you could tune in again. Okay, let's take a look at 1 Corinthians. Now what I'd like to do here is to introduce you not just to 1 Corinthians but to 1 and 2 Corinthians together a little bit, though I will say more about 2 Corinthians in another video. But I want to introduce you to the church, and particularly to Paul's relationship with the church, because we know quite a lot about this congregation in Corinth and how it grew and the kinds of issues Paul had as he was ministering to them. And if we can understand the backstory, kind of the big picture, it'll help us to make sense of both 1st and 2nd Corinthians. It will certainly make some of the chapters in 1 Corinthians really pop out. You'll see why Paul was so vigorous in things he said. And it'll also shed some light on the ministry of Paul and the backstory in the book of Acts and so on. So, let's go right back to the beginning. How did this church start? The church in Corinth was begun, it seems, in Acts chapter 18 when Paul made his first visit to them. He stayed there about 18 months, planted the church, and everything seemed at that stage to be going reasonably smoothly. Nothing is ever without problems, but there are no glaring catastrophes on the horizon. Then he leaves, he goes to Ephesus, and is there about 3 years. And from Ephesus, it looks like he wrote at least 2 letters to the Corinthians. Now, this is where it starts to get a little bit complicated. Turn with me to chapter 5, verse 9, 1 Corinthians 5, verse 9, where Paul says, quote, "I wrote to you in my letter not to associate with sexually immoral people." Whoa, hold on a second. Paul has written to them already by the time he writes 1 Corinthians. This letter is sometimes called the warning letter. And it's a letter which contained this warning about associating with sexually immoral people. It seems that the Corinthian church had misunderstood this. They had thought Paul meant you're not supposed to associate with anybody out in the world who's sexually immoral, and Paul has to correct that misunderstanding in chapter 5. Say, no, that's not what I meant. I meant don't associate with anybody who calls himself a brother and is sexually immoral and so on. You know all that from the end of 1 Corinthians 5. So what we learned, though, from that is that from Ephesus, or around about that time at least, Paul writes 2 letters. The warning letter, which we don't have, as far as we know, anywhere in the corpus of ancient Greek literature. And then 1 Corinthians. 1 Corinthians, in other words, is the second letter, at least the second, that he wrote. And these numbers are going to get confusing, so you give them letters. Let's say A is the warning letter, B is 1 Corinthians. With me so far? Excellent. Well, things get a little bit more complicated still, because at the end of 1 Corinthians, Paul announces his intention to visit them again. 1 Corinthians 16:5, "I will visit you after passing through Macedonia." And the question, of course, is, well, did he make that visit? What happened? And so on and so forth. And we know the answer to that from 2 Corinthians chapter 2. Let me read that to you and then explain some of what's going on here. "I made up my mind not to make another painful visit to you," he writes. Whoa, so hold on. What's going on there? What's the painful visit that he's talking about? It doesn't look like that's referring to his first visit where he planted the church. You wouldn't really call that a visit, probably. And more to the point, it doesn't look like it's the painful visit that Paul seems to describe here. So it seems that Paul did visit them again, and it was a painful encounter. Presumably, at least as far as we can tell from the content of both the letters, because he had to confront them face to face about some of the issues that previously he'd written to them about. Letters A and B, sexual immorality, and all the stuff in 1 Corinthians, which we'll come to in a few minutes. So, what have we got so far? The initial encounter, planting the church, the warning letter, letter B, 1 Corinthians, then a painful visit, in which he says, I'm not going to make another painful visit, but instead he writes to them. But what does he write? Keep reading 2 Corinthians chapter 2. "If I cause you pain, who is there to make me glad but the one whom I have pained?" He dearly loves this congregation, you see. "I wrote as I did, so that when I came I might not suffer pain from those who should have made me rejoice, for I felt sure of all of you that my joy would be the joy of you all. I wrote to you out of much affliction and anguish of heart, and with many tears, not to cause you pain, but to let you know the abundant love that I have for you." Right, well, what's going on here? Notice he refers in 2 Corinthians to another previous letter. Well, which letter is this? It doesn't look like the warning letter. It doesn't look like 1 Corinthians, letters A and B. it looks like most likely there's another letter in between 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians. The letter that Paul found painful, scholars sometimes call this the letter of tears. Verse 4, I wrote to you out of much affliction and anguish of heart and with many tears. So the tearful letter, let's call it that, is letter C. And then you've got 2 Corinthians, letter D. So you've got 4 letters and a couple of visits. And it looks like you've got another visit then. Paul goes back on his previous commitment not to make a painful visit to them. Maybe it's not a painful visit. Maybe it's a joyful visit. In Acts chapter 20, verses 2 and 3, he remarks that he came to... Luke, the narrator, remarks that Paul came to Greece and then he spent 3 months in Greece. And it's very unlikely that Paul will go to Greece, spend 3 months there and not visit Corinth. I mean, for all of the tension and so on, they were his dear friends. And it would be kind of odd for him not to go and visit his friends when he was in the neighbourhood. Apart from anything else, Corinth is also a fairly central city and a centre of transportation and so on. So what with him needing to warn them and also them being his friends, he probably made another visit to them then. But what you start to see is over a period of many years, quite a tense relationship, a really tense relationship, with multiple letters, sometimes letters that are misunderstood, visits that are painful, letters written to try and clear up some of the confusion. And then to add to that even more, when we get into 1 Corinthians, what we discover is that they were also writing back to him, to ask him questions, and perhaps to say a few other choice things as well. So that then takes us to 1 Corinthians, and just briefly we can start then to see what's going on in 1 Corinthians and why perhaps some of it has the kind of historical punch that it does. In the first few chapters of 1 Corinthians, for example, Paul has to speak about the divisions within the church in Corinth. And in anticipation of some of the themes that get touched upon in 2 Corinthians, he has to speak about the ministry of himself as an apostle and how that ministry ought to be understood and how it ought not to be misunderstood. It's not, in other words, the case, as we'll discover in 2 Corinthians, that apostles are known by their great power and the fact that they can float above all the cares of this world. They're known by the fact that they get their hands dirty in the everyday hassle and confusion and chaos of people's lives, and they seek to serve them and give themselves away for those whom they love. In chapters 5 and 6, both the issue of divisions in the church, chapter 6, lawsuits among believers, and the ongoing issue of sexual immorality rear their heads. The sexual immorality in Corinth was probably exacerbated by its location. If you know where it is, it's on a very narrow isthmus of land connecting two fairly large land masses, and so there was a lot of traffic through as people dragged boats from the sea on one side to the sea on the other, because it was easier to drag the boats across the land than it was to go all the way round that big bit of Greece that sort of pokes out into the Mediterranean. In that kind of context, where you've got lots and lots of people passing through for short periods of time, you get a lot of commerce, you get a lot of immorality, you get a lot of crime, and so on and so forth. You can imagine how that might have impacted the church. Then what you get, beginning chapter 7, is a series of, now concerning the matters about which you wrote. Remember that as well as Paul writing to them, they're writing to him. That probably indicates, by the way, that he has some kind of fixed location, which would make sense if he's in Ephesus, just down the road, so to speak. But they can write to him as well as him writing to them. And now concerning is the little phrase, or its equivalent in whatever translation you're using, which punctuates much of the rest of the letter. Chapter 7, verse 1, now concerning the matters about which you wrote, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. It's a euphemism probably for intimacy, sexual intimacy, or marriage. The idiom is used in a variety of different ways. Chapter 7, verse 25, now concerning the betrothed. Chapter 8, verse 1, now concerning food sacrificed to idols. That runs all the way through chapter 11. Interestingly, it's in that context that Paul talks about the Lord's Supper. And so it's interesting to think about the significance of the Lord's Supper in the light of the significance that Paul ascribes to eating food sacrificed to idols. He remarks, for example, in the middle of chapter 10, that when you participate in an idol temple, you're participating with demons. I don't want you to be participants with demons, he says. So that says something about the real connection that goes on when we participate in a feast of that kind. Chapter 12, famously now concerning spiritual gifts, all the way through chapter 14. Interesting that the love chapter is stuck in that context. This is not you're all loving and everything's fine, chapter 13. This is what you're not like because of the attitude to spiritual gifts that you've embraced. Then all the way through chapter 16, now concerning the collection for the saints, and now finally chapter 16 verse 12, now concerning our brother Apollos. Just one final thought then, in the middle of all that, with chapter 15, you've got this stuff about the resurrection of Christ, and it raises the question, well, what's that doing here? That isn't introduced with a now concerning phrase. It seems that that's not something that they raised with him, it's something he wants to raise with them. And it might be that somehow a right understanding of the significance of the resurrection of Christ is the theme that ties lots of these disparate strands together. Although how it does that is complex, and we'll probably have to talk about that another time if you'd like to do so. But hopefully that is a sufficiently enticing introduction to get you into 1 Corinthians again if you've not looked at it for a while. In the meantime, the Lord bless you, and I hope very much to see you soon. Bye for now.